Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my April wrap-up. So today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in April. I've read rather a lot this month. I appear to have read 17 books, which seems quite odd because I had a very busy month, but I do sometimes find that happens because if I'm less busy I'm sat in my house and I'm writing and I'm watching booktube videos and that kind of thing, whereas the more busy I am, the more time I spend sat on trains reading books. I also sort of half did the Genrethon this month. I didn't really properly commit myself to doing it because I had a very busy week, the week the Genrethon was being run. The Genrethon was being run by so many booktubers that I really like. I will link their channels down below, that I thought I would try and take part, so I didn't make myself read more in that week than I would have done if I hadn't been taking part, but I did try and make sure I read sort of different genres. But I will kind of point out in this wrap up where I read books for the Genrethon and where I didn't. So as always, I will start off with my monthly challenges. My general challenge this month was this, which is to read a book that is not a novel, i.e. a poetry, novella or non-fiction. And this month I read one non-fiction book, I read one short story collection, I read quite a few Penguin Little Black Classics, which tend to be of not really novel format, and I also read 3 collections of poetry, so I feel like I'm doing pretty well on that challenge. I've also been trying to read a non-fiction book every month this year, and this month for my non-fiction read I read this book, which is How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman, and this is so brilliant. I have mentioned this before because I actually started this back in January, but I read the bulk of this month and finished it and absolutely loved it. It's a fascinating, brilliant book. Basically it's a history of Victorian everyday life, so it takes as its structure a day in the life of an ordinary Victorian and kind of fills in a lot of details around it. As someone, I'm really interested in the Victorian period, but there are certain details of everyday life that when you read a lot of history books and when you read Victorian novels or even historical fiction, you just don't get little things like how do the Victorians brush their teeth, which are actually really fascinating. So this is a really brilliant book, and if you're interested in Victorian social history and in everyday life in the Victorian period, I cannot recommend this enough. I loved it so much. I think this might be my favourite non-fiction book I've ever read because it's so detailed and rich, so thoroughly readable, and at times kind of terrifying but also fascinating. And this was in fact also one of the books I finished during the Genrethon. The first book I picked from my TBR bowl this month was The White Family by Maggie G. I've been meaning to read something by Maggie G for ages. She was one of my tutors on my creative writing MA that I took last year, and she is an absolutely lovely woman and really fascinating and a brilliant teacher, so I really wanted to read something by hers and I finally got around to this. This book is very good. It's not a nice book. I'm not sure I can say that I liked it. It's a very difficult book. This book is a book about racism in London in the 21st century. It's set in a part of London that used to be very white and has become much more ethnically diverse over the years, and at the heart of this book is this couple, Mary and Alfred White, who have been there for a very long time and they have seen the neighbourhood change quite a lot, and Alfred especially is very angry about the changes and is very racist. Mary, his wife, is also racist but doesn't think she is, if that makes sense. Mary feels that she is much more progressive than in fact she actually is. They have 3 children, Darren, Shirley and Dirk, and Shirley's long-term partner is a black man. Their youngest son, Dirk, is incredibly racist and a very nasty, messed up boy. Basically this book deals with the kind of messed up relationships within this family that is often torn apart by their racist attitudes, especially towards Shirley's partner. It's not a nice book. It's very complicated and at times very difficult to read. Although it is at times very horrible to read, it is very powerful and very affecting, and I thought the ending was absolutely superb and very hard hitting. I think if you want to read about the problems of racism in today's society, there are 2 books you should read. One is Americana by Adichie and the other is this, The White Family, because Americana deals with what it is like to be on the receiving end of racism, whereas this book deals with the internal psychology of people who are racist and all the kind of complexities and hatreds that come with that. It is a very powerful, very well written, brilliant book, although at times quite difficult to deal with. And the other thing I picked out of my TBR bowl this month was conveniently the unfinished novels of Charlotte Bronte, which is good because this month marked the 200th birthday of Charlotte Bronte and it was nice to read some more by her this month. So I read these, which is basically, it consists of 4 unfinished novels, things that she started. She didn't get very far in either of them. Most of them are only a few chapters. You know, the stories don't finish and some of the stories start and then restart because they're obviously just drafts. I really enjoyed everything I read in this, but I really wish there was more of them. So I don't think that it's worth reading Charlotte Bronte's unfinished novels unless you absolutely love Charlotte Bronte, because they're not sort of long enough for you to really get your teeth into and you can't really get a grip on any of the characters or the stories. It's more just a kind of interesting look into her thoughts and her further writing beyond the novels that she did finish within her lifetime. But anyway, it was certainly an enjoyable and interesting read. Sticking with Charlotte Bronte's unfinished works, I also read this tiny Little Black Classics. So you may remember the Little Black Classics from Penguin that were brought out for their 80th birthday, which I will talk about more of them later, but this is one of the ones that were brought brought out for Penguin's 60th birthday, and I realised that my parents had quite a lot of these, so I borrowed this one when I spotted it on their shelves. This is Mina Laurie, so it's a little short story almost, I suppose, that Charlotte Bronte wrote when she was quite young. It has a lot of gaps in it, it isn't really complete, so there are parts where we have full scenes, there are parts where we just have like a few sentences telling us what's going on in between the full scenes. It's set in a sort of mythical land, and there is this duke, and the book basically follows two women and their relationships with the duke. It follows the duke's wife and also the duke's mistress, so it deals with some quite kind of dark, complicated stuff and some ideas of kind of duty and love and how it binds people together. And you can see some of the themes that come up in Jane Eyre and other later works sort of coming up in this as well, which I did really enjoy. Sticking with the Bronte theme, I also reread Agnes Gray this month. I won't say that much about this here because I already spoke about this in Bronte Week, and I will link my video from that down below. But Agnes Gray basically follows the impoverished daughter of a clergyman who goes out to become a governess, and the book follows her difficulties as a governess, the trouble she has dealing with particularly difficult charges. I think it's a very, very honest and brilliant novel, and presents quite an interesting portrait of the governess as a figure within Victorian history. I really liked it, and I was very glad to reread it. I also reread Anne Bronte's other novel, The Tenant of Welfare Hall, this month, which I was absolutely blown away by, as you will know if you watch my Bronte Week video. I thought this was so incredible. It starts off following a young man called Gilbert Markham, and then moves into his neighbourhood a widow called Mrs. Graham, who at first seems a bit mysterious, no one really knows much about her, no one knows where she's come from, and Gilbert and Helen Graham's relationship kind of develops. They get to know each other a bit better, and as they get to know each other a bit better, Gilbert discovers much more about her past and ends up reading Helen's diary, which makes up sort of the middle section of the book, in which we find out what has led Helen and her son to be in this deserted place, how they have come here, and what their lives were like before. It is a book about the Victorian institution of marriage. It is a book about domestic abuse in some ways. It is such a powerful, brilliant, brilliant book. I cannot recommend it enough. It is so good. It's so good. Anyway. Oh, and The Tenant of Welfare Hall I also finished during the Genrethon. Sticking with the classics, I also read Thomas Hardy's The Return of the Native. This is, I think, my 6th Hardy, and I very much do love Thomas Hardy. He has such brilliant, although at times very heart-wrenching plots, and I think his characters as well are done very well. I especially love his dialogue. It's interesting, when I was younger I think I loved Hardy for his rich plots and characters, whereas now I think I'm coming to really appreciate his writing style a lot more as well, and I really did enjoy this. I think this has probably come in as my 3rd favourite Hardy out of the 6 I've read, with Jude the Obscure and Far from the Madding Crowd coming above, because I do love both of them so much. It follows the lives of a few characters which are all linked by this place, Egdon Heath, around which they reside. So we have a young man called Clym Yearbright, who comes back after a long time abroad. We also have a young woman called Tamsin Yearbright, who is his cousin. We also have Eustacia Vi. I don't think that's how I say her name, but Hardy does like to give his female characters really eccentric names, such as Thomasin or Eustacia or Bathsheba in Far from the Madding Crowd. He does enjoy that, doesn't he? I feel like maybe Tess is significantly called Tess, which is a very ordinary name. Anyway, back to actually talking about Return of the Native. We have Eustacia Vi, a young woman who lives quite secluded from everyone else, and many people think she's a witch. She is treated quite suspiciously and people don't really like her. We also have a man called Damon Wildeve, and the lives of these 4 characters become very interweaved. At the beginning of the book, Thomasin runs away with Mr. Wildeve to become married, but we also find out shortly after that that there is a bit of a history between Mr. Wildeve and Eustacia, so all of these things kind of link together to create quite a messy situation. As always in Hardy, everything goes a little bit pear-shaped, but it's brilliant. I found the ending so powerful, and one of the characters in this book, who is not one of the central 4 but is still very important, is a man called Diggory Venn, and he is like the nicest, loveliest man. He is my new favourite character in Hardy. I think he is brilliant, and he really made this book for me. I also read A Figure in the Carpet by Henry James. I haven't really had that much experience with Henry James in general. I've read The Turn of the Screw before, so this is the 2nd thing I've read by him. It basically follows this man who becomes obsessed with this mystery that this writer has put into all his works. I didn't love this. I liked it, but I just don't find Henry James's style that engaging. I think I prefer The Turn of the Screw, but with both of them I always felt somewhat at a distance. I would like to read some of his full-length novels at some point as well, because I am intrigued, and I know he has quite a good reputation and he is writing from a period that I often really enjoy, but so far from what I've read of Henry James, I don't find that his narrative style tends to draw me in that much. This too was one of the ones that I read during the Genrethon, it being rather short. And another book that I read during the Genrethon Genrethon was this, which is The Mystery of the Blue Train by Agatha Christie. You may remember that last month I read The Moving Finger by Agatha Christie, which was my first Agatha Christie, and I really enjoyed it. I find her writing so utterly readable. I really very much did enjoy this. Again, I flew through it, and I find Agatha Christie's books very satisfying. As often in Agatha Christie, this one deals with a murder. Someone gets murdered on a train from London to France. Poirot was mysteriously on the train and of course ends up helping to solve the murder. I thought it was really enjoyable, and I'm definitely going to keep on reading Agatha Christie. But this month I also finished a book called Oh Dear Silvia by Dawn French, which I listened to on audiobook. I really enjoyed this. It was really interesting to read something by Dawn French because I'm very familiar with her comedy and I've been to see her live and stuff, but I just couldn't really imagine what a novel by her would be like. It's not, like, it's funny, but it's not as cheery as you might expect being from Dawn French. It's also quite dark. Oh Dear Silvia revolves around this woman, Silvia, who is in a coma, and the book is structured by visits to the hospital from various people and how they perceive her, and slowly we build up a picture of what Silvia's life has been like and all of the relationships that all these characters have towards us. I really enjoyed it. There are a few things, or there was one point that I just didn't believe, where the end got a little bit too over the top for me. However, the final ending I found so emotional that I kind of forgave it for one or two slightly over the top plot points along the way. The writing style was quite distinctive, and I can't tell if I'd have read it, if I'd have liked it as much. The audiobook is voice acted with a lot of very brilliant actors. The voice actors put so much emotion into the dialogue that I can't imagine what it would be like if I'd have read it and if it would have had as much of an emotional impact on me. However, I do really recommend it, especially the audiobook. It was definitely worth a read, and I'd be curious to read more by Dawn French in the future. I read Airborne by Kenneth Opel, which I thoroughly enjoyed. This was one of the books that Nick lent me at Christmas. I'm still working my way through. It's set on an airship and follows the cabin boy Matt Cruz in his kind of adventures. He becomes friends with one of the guests, one of the passengers on board the ship, and together they begin to investigate this sort of mystery of her grandfather. There are also sky pirates. I mean, what more do you want in a book? There are cool kind of mythical creatures, sky pirates, and a lot of like gender and class criticism almost, because the society they live in is not quite Victorian, but it feels a bit sort of older than ours. It's a little bit steampunky and it's just great, really gripping, really enjoyable. I'm very excited to read the sequel, which I will probably read next month. And I also listened to Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets on audiobook, which I did thoroughly enjoy. I'm really enjoying listening to Harry Potter at the moment because although I loved Harry Potter when I was a child, I don't think I appreciated them as much then as I actually do now, to be honest. I like Harry Potter for the same reason I like Charles Dickens. J.K. Rowling, like Dickens, has a very good balance between funny and dark, and I really appreciate that in a book. And I did really enjoy The Chamber of Secrets. I know it's a lot of people's least favourite, but I don't think that at all. I actually think it's a great one. I really like the plot structure, and I think the plot device of Tom Riddle's diary is very well done. It's a shame that Hermione is in it slightly less than in other books, because Hermione is of course awesome, but Professor Lockhart is so funny, and Dobby is great, and it's the first book where we get to see Lucius Malfoy, and there's a lot of brilliant stuff in The Chamber of Secrets. I'm also finding it really interesting rereading Harry Potter as an older reader. Me and my boyfriend Nick were talking about this the other day because both of us have read and really loved The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling, and when you first read The Casual Vacancy, it's a very political book. It has a lot of social criticism in it. It's the kind of thing that Dickens would write if he was alive today, I think. And when you read The Casual Vacancy, it is quite a shocking book, and at times it feels surprising that it's from the same author as Harry Potter, whereas now both me and Nick are listening to Harry Potter and we haven't experienced them for a while, and this is after we've both read The Casual Vacancy, and both of us were saying and finding that you can see the author of The Casual Vacancy in Harry Potter. It's just slightly more under the surface, but there is actually so much like political and social criticism in there, and it's brilliant. I also read this short story collection, which is The Not Dead and the Saved by Kate Clancy. I read Kate Clancy's novel Meeting the English a few years ago and loved it, which is part of the reason why I was so excited to get to this. And I'd also read one of the stories from this, The Not Dead and the Saved, the title story I'd read during my MA because my tutor recommended it to me as being really useful for what I was doing. This whole collection is just incredible. It's beautiful. Her writing style is just magnificent. I'm so excited to read whatever else Kate Clancy writes, and I really want to get my hands on some of her poetry, but she just writes incredibly, just so emotionally engaging. A lot of the stories are kind of linked by themes of family and especially motherhood, which I found really interesting. There are so many utterly brilliant stories in this collection. I think my favourites were probably Aunt Mary and the Child, which is beautiful, Irene, and also the title story, They're Not Dead and the Save. I think this is one of my favourite short story collections I've read so far. I also read for another one of my Genrethon reads, this other little black classic, which is Only Dull People Are Brilliant at Breakfast by Oscar Wilde. Basically, this little black classic just goes through various quotes by Oscar Wilde, just all of his wit, all of his brilliant wit. It just has some amazing, amazing little quotes in this, such as, "My duty to myself is to amuse myself terrifically. All great ideas are dangerous." And finally, onto some poetry. The first thing I read was Gunga Din and Other Favourite Poems by Rudyard Kipling. It was a really interesting collection and I did enjoy it. I quite like Rudyard Kipling and I find him a very interesting writer. However, this book was about half of his ballads, and in general his ballads are not my favourites of his poetry. Just the very form of the ballad feels very kind of sing-songy and old-fashioned, and I just don't, just doesn't really appeal to me that much. But some of the shorter poems in the collection I do really enjoy, and I do want to carry on reading his poetry more in the future, maybe get a collection that is slightly less ballad heavy. And I also read another one of my Genrethon reads was Emily Dickinson's My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun. Nick has been recommending Emily Dickinson to me for a very long time and I have only read bits and pieces of her poetry, so it was really nice to read quite a lot more of this and I absolutely loved this. I'm definitely going to be picking up something longer by Emily Dickinson in the future because her writing is just lovely. Most of Emily Dickinson's poems are very short and very powerful. I think the language is really lovely and I really thoroughly enjoyed this collection. A precious mouldering pleasure 'tis to meet an antique book, in just the dress his century wore, a privilege, I think. His venerable hand to take, and warming in our own, a passage back or two to make to times when he was young, his quaint opinions to inspect, his knowledge to unfold, on what concerns our mutual mind, the literature of old. What interests scholars most, what competitions ran, when Plato was a certainty and Sophocles a man, when Sappho was a living girl and Beatrice wore that gown that Dante defied. Facts centuries before he traverses familiar, as one should come to town and tell you all the dreams were true. He lived where dreams were born. His presence is enchantment, you beg him not to go. Old volumes shake their vellum heads and tantalise just so. And finally, the last thing I have to talk about is a poetry pamphlet called Goose Night by Kathy Pimlott. This is another poetry pamphlet by the Emma Press. I've spoken about them before. They produce really beautiful, lovely poetry pamphlets and the quality is, I think, very, very high. I just think they're brilliant, brilliant press. I will link their website and stuff down below. You can buy all their poetry pamphlets on their website. I really did enjoy this. I thought there were some lovely, brilliant poems in this. There are a couple of poems in this collection which all follow a woman called Enid, and I really, really enjoyed them because you get a proper sense of this character, this woman, from these different poems. I think they tie together really nicely. But I think my favourite poem in the collection was called 5 Unusual Things, and I will read that for you now. 5 unusual things. You open the quarter lights, get out of the car. 5 minutes, you say, and while I'm gone, look for 5 unusual things. And I'm alone on a back street of workshops and offices. No one appears. There are no balloons, no burglaries, nothing disturbs the street. 2/3 up the warehouse wall, the brick course swivels 90 degrees, 3 fanciful rows and then back to a sensible horizontal. I breathe on the window, draw a face that fades with the clearing mist, breathe again and it reappears. Years later, when you've been gone forever, clocking a sign for invisible menders, I say, for you, you don't see many of those. So, those are all the books that I have read this month. There were quite a lot. Just to remind you all, my Dickens read-along of Our Mutual Friend has now started. This month we will be reading chapters 1 to 4 of Our Mutual Friend. I will put a link down below to the Goodreads group, so do go and join it. We're going to be reading Our Mutual Friend in a serialised fashion in the way the Victorians would have originally read it, and I am very, very excited. So anyway, that is all I have to say today. I think I'll be back very soon, and in the meantime, happy reading. Please let me know what you have read this month, and if you had a good reading month.